Hello everyone, welcome back to my podcast. I'm Adrian Lloyd and this is just my stupid opinion. And today we're going to be discussing Justin Trudeau's recent cabinet shuffle. So Justin Trudeau ended up doing a cabinet shuffle with his main focus being on Indigenous affairs. And one thing that's important to know starting off is that Justin Trudeau pandered a lot to the Indigenous people during the 2015 campaign. One thing he talked about mainly was at the time there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now that looked into Canada's residential schools where Aboriginal people were sent. And many were abused, tortured, and died. Eventually, in the end, they found out about 6,000 Indigenous children died inside these residential schools. So that report came out leading up to the election campaign. When this came out, Justin Trudeau was one of the strongest voices talking about how he is going to make reparations for all this. This just shows how Canada has treated the Indigenous people, especially considering that the last residential school closed down in, I believe it was 1996. That's actually within my lifetime. Probably within the lifetime of many people who are watching or listening to this. It's kind of crazy when you think about it. A school that was meant to take people in and essentially re-educate them on how they should believe, how they should think, how they should view their culture. And that is within our lifetime. It's really hard to think about it. The Indigenous people is always one group that I felt has gotten the shittiest end of the stick. You can look into the living conditions. They generally live under corrupt chiefs with very little running water, and a lot of times the water they have is dirty and needs to be taken care of before you can even drink it or use it. They're not given much in the way for federal funding for education. In general, they've just really gotten the short end of the stick. So Justin Trudeau decided to focus on them for his election. Well, I can tell you one thing, he forgot about them very quickly once he got into office. This cabinet shuffle was allowing him to refocus his efforts on getting back the Indigenous vote. First thing we need to know is it was actually triggered by a longtime Liberal MP stepping down. This woman was Judy Foote, and she was the Minister of Public Services and Procurement. And she announced on, I believe it was August 24th, that she was resigning from her position to focus more on family. Now, in the past, Ms. Foote has had 2 bouts with cancer, and she ended up bringing this up when she was talking about her resignation, but she says as far as she knows, she is cancer-free. That being said, she stepped away from her post in April. She said she did it for personal reasons. But she said she's cancer-free, so that's good. But one thing she did bring up is she has the BRCA gene. It's a hereditary gene which leads to several types of cancer, and she has a couple children. So she ended up saying that when it hits your children, it's a totally different ballgame. So Judy Foote is out as Minister of Public Service and Procurement. So Justin Trudeau has to fill this role. And he does so with Carla Qualtrough, who is the former Minister of Sports and Persons with Disabilities, but she is moving into the position of Minister of Public Service and Procurement. So this shuffle triggered Trudeau to focus on Indigenous affairs, and he did this by first splitting up the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Department. So right now, the Indigenous Affairs Department is run by Minister Caroline Bennett, but she has become the new Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. Also, another move is Minister Jane Philpott, who is the former Health Minister, but she is taking over as the new Indigenous Services. So that's 2 moves that Justin Trudeau's made in order to free him up to make this change in Indigenous affairs. And filling the rest of the role, he moved Jane Philpott from Health Minister to that position in New Indigenous Services. Filling the role for her is Jeanette Petitpas of New Brunswick. We still have the Minister of Sports and Persons with Disabilities position open after Carla Qualtrough got moved. So that was being taken over by Kent Hare, who is the former Veterans Affairs Minister. In exchange for that, a new rookie MP is coming in from Newfoundland, who is a personal friend of Justin Trudeau, Seamus O'Regan, and he's taking over Veterans Affairs. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's what the shuffle was, and what does this mean? Now, what was the reason for this restructuring of the Indigenous Affairs Office? The government released a statement saying that, quote, it's an attempt at systematic change towards nation-to-nation relation with Indigenous people, end quote. Canada has always had a rough relation with the Indigenous people, even though we talk a lot about how much they've been mistreated and how much we need to do for them. Typically, the government, I would say, especially under Harper's government, there was very little done to assist the First Nation people. I will admit, though, Harper took over office when I was younger, so there might have been some moves made that I am unaware of from in the past. But as far as I remember, Harper never did much for the Indigenous people. This left it wide open for Trudeau to take, which he did. Another thing the government says is that it has to do with restructuring the Indian Act. And the Indian Act was first passed in 1867, and this had to do with how the government interacts with First Nation tribes. So the government doesn't have control over the native land. So things such as pipelines would be one, where the government wants to lay pipelines throughout the country. Some of it, actually many times I should say, in the past it has passed over Indigenous lands. And the Indigenous people don't want pipelines running through their lands, so this has caused a bigger uproar because the government is not respecting the Indigenous people's right to their land and tend to go ahead and do it anyway. A lot of times they do a publicity stunt where they're trying to get the First Nation people to go along with it, but when the First Nation people don't, then usually it just goes along anyway. Now, how is this dismantling of Indigenous affairs supposed to go down? Well, as stated, Trudeau appointed two people to enact this. That is Minister Caroline Bennett and Minister Jane Philpott. So Bennett's job is to help oversee a consultation process of the department's dissolution. So at the moment, Indigenous Affairs is still going and it will slowly be dismantled. And Philpott's job is to help improve the quality of services with it, quote, rigorous results and delivery approach, end quote. Literally nothing more than that. Just rigorous results and delivery approach. If the government doesn't give you specifics, there's absolutely no reason to trust what they're going to do. A reason for some of these moves may seem a little weird, but they actually make sense when you look at it with some perspective. Judy Foote was a minister of 28 years experience, but she had at least 20 in elected politics. Trudeau just lost her, so she's definitely a strong ally to have, somebody who knows the in and outs of the system. So he's going to move his stronger people up to fill this position, to try and fill this role of this 20-year veteran. But then, I stated earlier, Seamus O'Regan, he's a rookie MP who's coming in to the Veterans Affairs position, and he's also a personal friend of Trudeau. Why is that significant? Being friends means that he can trust O'Regan, and O'Regan will vote the way he wants. But if we look at this, O'Regan is an MP from Newfoundland. So is Judy Foote. And again, Judy Foote is a long-standing MP from there. And if we look at the electoral map from this past election, we got a lot of votes on the Maritimes there. So the main reason to move O'Regan in is really to maintain the Newfoundland and Labrador vote. Because if they don't have the representation, then there's an opening there, because the Conservatives during their leadership election were campaigning hard on the Maritimes, trying to win back votes there. Trudeau can't risk losing the Maritimes or he will lose office without a doubt. This whole cabinet shuffle I see as a desperate move by Justin Trudeau. It's him trying to do damage control. First and most basic, as I stated, he's losing a long-time MP He's trying to do damage control to fill that hole there. Meanwhile, he's trying to hold down the Maritimes, which, as far as I know, has not done too much for. But if he loses the Maritimes, if they go blue, then he can pretty much consider himself out of office. And finally, he's trying to win back as much Indigenous vote as possible. He really pledged to them during the 2015 election run. But still, some went orange and they ended up voting NDP. He's trying to win those back. But more importantly, if we look over the last couple of years, he's been in a lot of trouble with the Indigenous people. A good example is this, as I stated at the beginning, about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This commission and the impact it had was a big thing for Trudeau during the election run. So Trudeau has backed away from some of these key promises to them. Some of his promises would have required the government to publish legal opinions it received regarding Indigenous and treaty rights. And so this could have effects in court challenges. And again, I brought up about pipelines. One they mentioned was Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain pipeline. And there's also the Enbridge Line 3. So these were important pipelines that now Indigenous people could actually have a real legal say in what happens with it. And this was one of the big things that Trudeau said he was going to do. But this pledge was also among 94 calls of action made by Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission after his 2015 investigation. So a few years ago, when Trudeau was still in opposition to Stephen Harper's Conservative Party, when Harper was still Prime Minister, he promised to implement all of these recommendations once his government was in power as a commitment to improve Canada's relations with Indigenous people. However, as stated, he's backed away on many of these promises. And then, of course, we return to the residential schools. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations were meant to deliver a full reconciliation between the government and Indigenous people, and this was to help ensure that we didn't repeat mistakes we made in the past. Yeah, right. Ensuring mistakes from the past are not repeated, like the government does not repeat mistakes from the past. So another thing that was stated in this report is just how the government, pretty much at all levels, seems to have a very adversarial relationship with Indigenous people, and that repairing the relationship would require more transparency in court. So when Indigenous people were pushing for this, there was some pushback because Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould told the National Observer that some of the legal opinions must remain confidential to protect solicitor-client privilege. This is pretty much a very basic law. The same thing applies to pretty much any of us. If you're doing a contract, there are certain things you need to protect. You need to keep quiet. We even do this in our regular jobs. I sign a contract at work, and there are certain things I'm not allowed to say. So, when saying that this was necessary, the Indigenous people really felt that that's their way of nudging them out. I do see that this as I could actually see this being a valid situation for the government. But still, I feel like this is going to be more used to suppress the Indigenous people than it would be, more than it is for legal purposes. Another thing he got in trouble for was over funds for Native social services. And pretty much what Justin Trudeau said is that Native communities do not yet know how they would spend additional funds for child welfare and health services. Well, those are pretty specific funds, so they don't really have much say otherwise. It's either got to go to one of those two, and I know there are subsections that the money then goes to, but considering how it either goes to child welfare or health services, I don't see how they could not make the decisions for their own social services. When asked this week to explain why the Liberals, who came to power promising a new relationship with Canada's Indigenous people, are not providing First Nations with the cash that would pay for same level of social services available off reserve, Mr. Trudeau said Native communities are still building their social service capacities and trying to decide what the money should buy, and that will take time. And he said, quote, "In the history of the Canadian relationship, it's been very rare that you had a government say to Indigenous communities, 'What do you need? We have money there. We're already invested in you. You just need to tell us how you need us to spend it, where you're going to spend it, and how you can best help.' Well, a lot of Indigenous communities haven't had the opportunity yet to take that responsibility, to actually think about how they can and must deliver social services." Okay, this next part is just my stupid opinion, but I think they can, at very least, decide for themselves. I know what Justin Trudeau said. He says that it's very rare the government say, "We have the money for you, you spend it." Considering their past, probably would be a good idea to just give them the money and let them go. The one thing I do think, though, the government would be necessary for is oversight, because there is a history of corrupt chiefs inside Indigenous tribes. They keep the money for themselves and they live like kings while the rest of the people are left suffering. So, the one thing I would say is that the government's only job is to ensure that the entire fund of the entire flow of cash goes to where it's supposed to be and is not getting pocketed by any corrupt chiefs. That would be my opinion on that. The Liberal government believes it is essential for First Nations to make such decisions for themselves. Mr. Trudeau said, quote, "When we talk about reconciliation, when we talk about the true future of partnership with First Nation, Métis Nation, and Inuit people in this country, we recognize it took hundreds of years to get here. It's going to take many, many generations to end this legacy." End quote. But First Nation leaders say it is wrong to suggest their communities are unready to handle additional cash for social services. I agree with them on that. Should be their money, so give it to them. One reason I believe Justin Trudeau is pandering to the Maritimes and also the Indigenous people is because his approval ratings are starting to drop. If we look at the difference between 2016 to 2017, he's dropped a fair amount. About, somewhere between 11 and 9 points. However, if we look at the party's approval ratings, this was posted on campaignresearch.ca on June 22nd, 2017. And it says just fewer than 4 out of 10 individuals surveyed would support the federal Liberals, 39%, if an election were held tomorrow. Conversely, 3 out of 10 of those surveyed would support the Conservatives, 30%. As a result, the gap between the two parties from last month is narrowing. May 14th, Liberals 43%, Conservatives 27%. That was also before the Conservative leadership election that happened on May 27th, I believe. The Liberal lead is currently 9 points, which represents a decrease of 7 points since May. The NDP have support of 1/5, 19%, and this has not changed in several months. So we can see the Conservative Party is starting to gain on Trudeau, which is to be expected. In Canadian politics, it's really always come down between these two. Last election is actually looked like it was going to be between Mulcair and the Conservatives. But Justin Trudeau snuck up in the polls and overtook Mulcair after Mulcair got too protective of his lead and didn't wow anybody. He just fell back on his Stop Harper campaign, which got very boring very quickly. So no one is actually expecting to go to the polls tomorrow, because here it still shows that the Liberals would win. But we're going to the polls in just over 2 years. If this trend continues with Justin Trudeau, and he doesn't seem like he's changing his stance. He's still the classic social justice warrior, or as Gad Sad, the Gadfather, would say, he has ostrich parasitic syndrome. then Justin Trudeau may see his favorability continue to drop and the Conservatives continue to gain. And if we go to the polls in 2 years, and this is what is to be expected with this trend to continue, then he can pretty much pack his bags and get out of office. That being said, historically, prime ministers and presidents who win a first term will usually win a second one. I'm hoping that does not happen for Justin Trudeau. I think he has very dangerous policies. I think they're dangerous financially. I'm not even a good economics guy. I don't really have much of a head for that, but I can just see by the policies that the Liberals are doing, it cannot be good to help get us out of debt or balance the budget. And then some of his social policies, they're complete SJW policies, and they're actually causing harm to open debate. And I think these are all things that are going to have to get rolled back when someone else comes into office. Now, Andrew Scheer is not my guy, and I think he was the wrong guy to get elected. But I would support him over Justin Trudeau right now. Because so far, I'm not crazy about the NDP. They're going through a leadership race right now, and I am not liking the choices. So my choice right now, as it stands, would either be voting Conservative, which I would not be crazy about, or Libertarian Party, possibly. I'm going to do one episode where I look into the Libertarian Party. But that's it for me for now. I want to thank you for joining me here on Just My Stupid Opinion. I'm Adrian Lloyd. I'll catch you soon.